The answer choices to this question make it very clear that I need to think about punctuation. And since we have some of the more advanced punctuation marks like colons and semicolons, we have to also think about sentence structure because those have very specific rules. So let's start by thinking about the sentence that is just the one with the blank, right? So we can kind of ignore the beginning sentence. He is known for enforcing a moral code called the law of piety, which established the sanctity of animal life, the just treatment of the elderly, and the abolition of the slave trade. So we end here with a list. So that might affect it. Commas are used for lists, but sometimes semicolons are too, and sometimes colons are, right? So let's think about those first punctuation marks, the semicolon and the colon, we should think about first because they have much more narrow rules. Commas can be used in all sorts of reasons, but the semicolon only really has one main rule. Since we only see one semicolon, we know it's not the rule about lists, which only happens rarely on the SAT. It's the rule about using a semicolon as a period. So we have to think, could the sentence end where this semicolon would go? Let's read it again. He is known for enforcing a moral code called the law of piety, which established the sanctity of animal life. Yeah, that does sound like a sentence to me, right? We could just end it there. But then what about the part after? The just treatment of the elderly and the abolition of the slave trade. Well, that's not a sentence, right? That's the continuation of the list. And so it's definitely not a sentence. And that would eliminate choice B, but it would also eliminate choice C because we can use a colon with a list if we want. It's not the only reason to use a colon though. So just be clear, lists and colons are not necessarily going to go together, but we do have a sentence before the colon in this case. And it's okay to not have a sentence after the colon. But in this case, it would be very weird to end the sentence right in the middle of the list and then to have a colon and then continue the list, right? Where a colon is a very hard stop, a very absolute punctuation mark, kind of like a period that really ends a thought. And so to then continue the list on the other side makes no sense. So it's right in certain grammatical ways, but in this case, it's definitely still wrong because it's breaking apart an idea that we really want to keep together. And then hopefully we can now decide between a comma and a lack of any punctuation at all that we do need a comma here. The reason is that it's a list and we have commas in lists, right? So we have a comma right before the and, so we should have a comma right here where we're kind of moving from the first item in the list to the second, right? So just to be clear, here are the three things in the list. This guy established three things: the sanctity of animal life, the just treatment of the elderly, and the abolition of the slave trade. So it's a simple list, just like you would make in your own essays for school. We just use commas to separate all of those items in the list. So it is very basic punctuation rules that we're using here. The key though is commas do have lots of complex rules and different situations where we're going to use them. So I recommend that for any punctuation question that involves a semicolon or a colon, start with those. They have much more narrow rules. And so you might be able to eliminate two answers pretty confidently, and then it doesn't even matter. And plus, if one of them were right, we wouldn't have to worry about the complex comma rules because we would have the right answer. So starting with those simpler punctuation marks usually makes the rest of the question much easier, even if the rest of the sentence is kind of confusing.